on the idea of the serotonin system and stress, you were saying how there are these kind of subsections that may, the 1A system may be involved in kind of in coping, kind of persevering, and then the 2A psychedelic system might be involved in more this kind of PIMS type radical change. There's, I guess most people's idea of what serotonin is this kind of old story, I guess in the 70s, I think, of like it's basically the happy chemical, it's the mood chemical, right, which comes from this simple story of, it seems that classics, serotonergic antidepressants increase serotonin activity, so maybe depression's a deficit of serotonin, which seems to be a consensus that kind of isn't really what's going on. But yeah, this idea that there seems to be a lot of evidence, right, that serotonin system is really involved with stress.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think if you look at, granted, a lot of systems are involved with stress. Try and find a neurotransmitter system that you can say is involved with stress, but particularly the serotonin system, I think. And so, any type of physical, mechanical stress, heat stress, serotonin system modulates. Social stress is a big one. So clearly different responses to stress. Yeah, and I think you do definitely get a different phenomenological profile when you just release a bunch of serotonin in the brain, for instance, via MDMA or something, than when you just hit the 2A receptors, certainly. And what might be happening in terms of spiritual experience or psychosis, either you might have a downregulation of the 1A receptor and an relative upregulation of the 2A receptor, or you could just have targeted activation of 2A receptors through the release of neurotransmitter or something. So there's various ways that you can get a preferential activation of the 2A receptor.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, so again, for anyone who's not familiar with how this stuff works, so you've got neurons and they've got these receptors on them, and the serotonin kind of connects to it and then activates a series of processes in the neurons, right? And so one thing you can have is different expression of the neurons between people because of their genetics. And again, in the paper, you cite some interesting studies looking at how certain genes are associated with the genes that produce the serotonin 2A receptor are related to anxiety and different kind of and PTSD as well. So there seems to be this link to stress there, but then also, the changes in just how many of these are produced over time in different individuals, the kind of expression level, depending on things like psychosis. And there was a really interesting bit where, so you talk about, the kind of the recent context, the kind of stress, the chronic stress building up, and then a kind of an acute stress event producing these pivotal mental states. And then kind of parallel it with the idea that maybe there's a kind of background change in the expression level, that you're kind of building up the number of these serotonin 2A receptors. And then when the stressful event happens, there's a kind of burst of serotonin activity, and that's the kind of mechanism that triggers the pivotal mental state. Is that a fair representation?
Yeah, absolutely. And we mentioned that. I think there's probably a variation to and exactly the dynamics of how these 2A receptors can be activated. But let's take the example, for instance, of depressive phenotypes. So depression. A lot of studies have mentioned there might be increased serotonin 2A receptor expression. So more proteins of these serotonin 2A receptors embedded in the membrane, ready to be activated by the serotonin or possibly endogenous psychedelics. And then, some stressful event happens. It could even be a good event, like, you're falling in love, or you get really into work or something that increases excitatory neurotransmission, and you have more receptors to be activated, right? And then you can transition from this depressive type profile to a psychotic type profile. And you definitely see this in although it's, I think there's a lot of overlap here between bipolar psychoses and schizophrenia psychoses that I won't get into, but this transition from kind of a depressed like state to a hyperactivated psychotic like state.
Right.
And so I'd say, that model holds, because in something like psychotic disorder, sometimes you actually see less expression of the serotonin 2A receptors in a really florid psychosis. And that's difficult to interpret, but it could be that they've been bombarded by so much serotonin that this is getting into neuroscience territory. I apologize if we're getting really into the weeds here, but that could create an internalization and downregulation of the serotonin 2A receptors. So,
okay. So if we, so you've got this idea that you've got this system in the brain that's kind of evolved for rapid change. So you've got the 1A system where you're actively coping, and then is it, so would the idea be that when things have really got to a point where you're incredibly stressed, or things are really going wrong, and you need to suddenly learn, you need to kind of turn about and kind of reconfigure your perception of the world, is that the kind of thing that would trigger the PIMS, or pivotal mental state?
Sure. And so I think it could be a chronic stress buildup, or it could be intense transient stress. So for instance, in a near-death experience, if a stressor is intense enough, it can activate, it can kind of induce a PIMS as well. So I think one of the most likely times to have a near-death experience is during cardiac arrest. People coming out of cardiac arrest will report having a near-death experience. And there's at least one paper that shows the likelihood of that is related to how much CO2 you have circulating in your body. And there's other people that suggest, serotonin neurons in the brainstem are sensitive to CO2 in terms of they're chemosensitive to the pH of the body. And so that could be a mechanism to trigger a PIMS. It seems like a lowering of the body's pH could be implicated in a lot of responses to stressors. So you have that, you could have that with starvation. You could have that with insane exercise routines, or lack of oxygen, and these types of things. Now, I should mention that it might not all be the serotonin 2A receptor. Some of these stressors seem to increase the circulation of NMDA receptor antagonists like kynureninic acid. And so there you could have, you got a little bit of increased serotonin 2A receptor activation and increased antagonism of this NMDA receptor, which kind of would mirror a ketamine-like effect. And so you could see how those things would interact to produce, more intense experiences.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, because as you say, the NMDA receptor is the main site that ketamine acts on, right? So that's
right.
a really interesting idea. So with, I guess, the idea of this is evolutionarily beneficial and it's adaptive, because there are circumstances where things go really wrong, and you get something. You might have post-traumatic stress disorder from a really traumatic, stressful event, but you also might have post-traumatic growth, right, where you need to learn to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Absolutely. And you could view the some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder as actually an adaptation in themselves. So for instance, an extreme response to a stimuli that is threatening could in some ways be advantageous, or to a lesser degree, like a lesser response could be advantageous. So for instance, if I've come to be, I'll use this example again, I used it recently, but if I like dogs and I'm normally just go up and pet dogs all the time, if the next dog I go to pet tries to rip my throat out and is almost successful doing that, it would be beneficial for me to radically adapt to that last dog and disproportionately learn from that experience, just in the off chance that that's going to happen again. I wouldn't want to weight that experience equally to all my previous experiences of friendly dogs, or else I'm going to lessen my chance of survival probably. And so you can see how you want to disproportionately learn from very stressful experiences. And in that sense, a form of a lesser form of traumatic response to stress might be beneficial.
Right. Yeah. And I think this is a really crucial point, because we were talking earlier about the serotonin system maybe being involved in stress, but then you might say, well, why does serotonin 2A receptor activation with a psychedelic, why does it produce these kind of cathartic emotional release experiences and positive psychological transformation? But here you're saying, well, you've got this system that evolved for these kinds of like snapshot, like we're going to reconfigure everything. So at a physiological level, when you activate that receptor, you're setting in motion all the processes that are necessary to increase plasticity between neurons, right, for learning. And then if you take a psychedelic, you're kind of artificially activating that same system, and then as a result, you can have all these positive therapeutic effects that we see in the literature, right?
Yep. That's I would say that's a pretty good interpretation. Yeah.